Afghanistan has got under my skin. It's got under my skin mentally and it's got under my skin physically.
Although I was in Afghanistan, I don't really feel that I understand the country any better than I did when I went out. I certainly know that when my time was up, I was very, very glad to leave.
If we look at what's been achieved since 2001, I feel that we've delivered shoddy goods.
They have a saying in Afghanistan, you know, that when you leave you take some of the dust with you. It's really dusty everywhere.
I got hit. My feet were gone within a second. They would turn to dust, I guess.
I've heard it said that they don't even use the future tense much in Dari and Pashto because they never really think that they're going to have much of the future.
Jamil Jan, salam. Salam.
Hey, salam, salam.
How are you?
I'm very good. Welcome to Kabul,
It's so
Afghanistan.
good to see you.
I've just arrived in Afghanistan and my friend Jamil Siddiqui has come to pick me up from the airport. In 2004 I lived and worked here for 6 months, training journalists and helping reconstruct the media. Jamil was my translator.
Thank you so much for coming, and we can go into the city from here?
Yeah.
So Jamil, how have you been these 7 years since I've seen you? And how is the city? Because when we flew over, it's so much bigger than I remembered.
Yeah, there are new changes, there are a lot of new buildings. I think the city is a bit busy comparing to 7 years ago. So things have changed, but you can see better than me because you've not been here for 7 years.
I'm Julia Paul and I've flown here from my home in Belfast, where I've lived for more than a decade now. But I'm one of just thousands of people from Northern Ireland who've spent time here in Afghanistan, as aid workers, as contractors, as soldiers. This year, Afghanistan is at a crossroads as the Western troops withdraw and hand over responsibility for security to the Afghan forces. So I've been meeting some of those people from Northern Ireland and asking them just what has Afghanistan meant to them.
Well, Jamil has left me now, and I'm back at the house that I used to live in nearly a decade ago now. So I'm just coming upstairs to sort my room out, and it really is incredible, the changes to this property. I mean, as you can hear, it's a big, fairly luxurious house by Kabul standards. There's about sort of 6 or 7 rooms here, but it's all been decorated. It was quite sort of austere when we were here. It's now these beautiful Afghan carpets on the floor. But really, I suppose the biggest changes are the security measures. I'm just walking through to the room that I used to have, and there are these big steel doors everywhere. In case of any sort of attack, it means that you can lock yourself into an inner chamber. And if I walk through here, what was a sort of upstairs kitchen has now become a security room, and there's a screen here with monitoring all of the CCTV cameras which are all around the property, checking every angle. So it's quite a different feeling to it.
I was last here in 2006, the year Western troops began to expand into the south of Afghanistan to extend the peace-building programme. It's hard to believe now, but at that time, most people in the UK had never heard of places like Kandahar and Helmand province. After all, the war was supposed to be over.
The Friday morning calm across Kabul was shattered by a series of explosions and volleys of small arms fire.
And that vehicle down there, I think, got an injured kid. No, that's carrying injured! DNA, I'm not...
Thousands of US, British and Afghan troops were airlifted into Taliban strongholds in Helmand province. Afghan officials say 5 insurgents have been killed.
Nobody expected to be fighting such a brutal war in 2006. And I remember this battle in Garmsir, where we were literally fighting hand to hand, and I had to use my bayonet on a Taliban fighter. That's the whole way things were back then. My name is Captain Doug Beattie. I've been a soldier for 33 years, and I'm serving with the Royal Irish Regiment. And I first went there in early 2006 when the British forces first went to Helmand. I was involved in a major conflict in the south of the country in a place called Garmsir, where there was quite a sustained battle which lasted about 14 days. And I left in January 2007 with the intent to leave the military, but I was asked to stay, and I returned to Afghanistan for a second tour in 2008. We expected things would then get better, but what had really happened was all the fighting had just created the insurgency to be even more deeper in Helmand, and more insurgents flocked to that part of Afghanistan, and they were there from all quarters. Some of them were just Muslims who felt it was that they had to fight for their culture. Some were farmers who didn't want us to be there. Some were paid who were fighting. Some were Al-Qaeda, and of course some were Taliban. But we put them all under the umbrella of being Taliban. I certainly suffered a degree of mental anguish after my 2006 tour, which I had problems dealing with, and that was compounded by going back in 2008.
That's the Afghanistan that Colm McGowan also remembers. The 29-year-old from West Belfast was stationed in the north of the country, but the fighting was no less fierce.
I was doing my job as a professional soldier, part of the 1st Battalion Irish Guards unit. We were deployed to Afghanistan, and I went readily to do my job, and I wasn't over there getting a suntan, I was over there doing business. We were on a fighting patrol, and the Taliban had been hitting us from a specific area over maybe a fortnight. They were drawing us in and had set a couple of little traps for us. And I hit a tree line. I pick up a reading and I take a couple of steps, and it was an IED, and it was quite a interesting experience. So I'm in the air. I'm blinded. I land. I'm dragged away. And it took me maybe 30 or 40 seconds to realise what was going on, and then after about that 30, 40 seconds, it dawned on me what happened.
What had happened was that Colm had stood on a bomb. He lost both feet and most of one leg.
Well, I got hit. My feet were gone within a second. They would turn to dust, I guess, or mist or whatever, and propelled me quite high. It felt like 30 feet. It was probably 10 or 12 feet, but enough time to spin a couple of times before landing on my back.
It's almost impossible to take in what Colm has been through, but because of the conflict in Afghanistan, it's an experience that hundreds of UK troops have had. But Colm is determined to see the positive.
The worst that could have happened to me didn't happen, because I'm here talking to you, Julia. So, I'm a sort of glasses half full sort of bloke.
How can they know what we go through? The fear and doubt, the solitude, the highs.
And yet, there are those who fought in Afghanistan and came home with a very different legacy.
We came here for who knows why, a reason that has long since died. My name's Joanne McParland. I am a poet living and working in Belfast. At the start of 2012, I found myself in Afghanistan. I was in the Territorial Army, and I went out to work with the Royal Logistic Corps. I was working in Camp Bastion, and I had to leave, and go out and do patrols and bring equipment and supplies and people from one place to another. And you're out and about in the Helmand province, and everyone's heard all the stories about what can happen, and roadside bombs and shootings and all the rest. At the same time, you have a job to do. So it was a very difficult in the sense where it was pressure all the time. Although you're with a group of people, when you're in a situation like that, you are completely alone. And I found that through my writing, I was able to give myself a way out of the situation that I found myself in. I know you really love the country, but I certainly know that when my time was up, I was very, very glad to leave.
Joanne McParland is right. I do really love Afghanistan, and it's also inspired me to put pen to paper. I'm now writing my first novel, which draws on my time living and working here. But then my experiences of living here are very different to those of the soldiers.
I'm sitting in the garden of our house listening to the haunting melody of the call to prayer, and it has to be one of the sounds that I most remember from Afghanistan, which really evokes the sense of being here in this country. It's an incredibly beautiful and yet mournful sound, and it's the soundtrack to life here because you hear it wherever you are in the city, several times a day, in the early hours of the morning, last thing at night, and it really tells you where you are.
Explain to you why and what we might learn from it, but I want to read a passage from the New Testament later in the service. I want to read.
So what is it like to live in this country?
Well, driving certainly was the most dangerous thing I was involved in, and it is quite crazy. I remember I used to just ask God to help me to keep the car on the road and not hit anybody. The driving.
Graham Connor is a Presbyterian minister in Saintfield. He and his wife Pat spent several years living and working in Afghanistan. Graham was the minister for the international community. Pat, who's a nurse, worked for an organisation helping children with cleft palate and trained nurses.
In terms of being a woman out there, yes, it is very different, and I think Graham probably would have felt a bigger measure of freedom than I would. The headscarf, or the chador, as it's known, it took a while to get used to that, I must admit, but the first few times I remember going out without something on my head and suddenly realising and feeling very bare in the street and just going back home again to get it, because it really, you do want to blend in as much as you can and respect local people's views on head coverings and just modestly dressing. And there were times I began to think, this is, dressing up like my granny rather than the way I would normally dress at home.
I enjoyed life in Afghanistan. I think Afghans are quite like Irish people with the same sense of humour. We laugh at ourselves and we don't mind laughing at ourselves, so I had good fun that way. I think the basic things in life are hard, and it only takes a small thing to make a family be pushed over the edge in Afghanistan. It could be just a short illness and suddenly there's no money to pay for that, and then they go into debt. So little things can make a huge difference in the ordinary Afghan's life, in terms of just getting food on the table and a house to live in. It just is an amazing country, beautiful, starkly beautiful. But you're really talking about a medieval society outside the big cities.
And I still thank God whenever I get into the shower, pretty much every day, for a clean, fresh shower and for a clean roof over my head, for a comfortable bed, because just so many Afghans don't have these simple things that we just take for granted every single day. Whenever I think of what those folk have been through, I mean, we've been through a lot here in Northern Ireland, but they have just had war after war, and they have been through so much, and they're such a poor people, and yet they still have that wonderful sense of hope. And being in one of their houses and a group of women together, and they just throw back their burqas and they can laugh and joke, and they're sitting in the middle maybe of, a little ghetto of mud houses, and yet they've still got such a lot of hope and joy in their lives at times, and that's wonderful to see.
Tonight I'm on my way out to see another old friend in Kabul, but not an Afghan one. I'm heading to Sufi, a well-known restaurant that serves traditional food.
My name's Mark Armstrong. I'm a journalist. I worked for the BBC for many years, mainly in Northern Ireland, and I'm here in Kabul, still as a journalist. I edit a radio station which is ostensibly independent but is paid for by ISAF, or NATO, if you like. We run traditional news in the sense that we cover all sorts of different walks of life in Afghanistan, but there's undoubtedly an element in which we put out the kind of stories, the very positive stories, about positive developments in Afghanistan that NATO would like us to put out.
When I was offered the job to come training here, it was partly because of the work that I'd done in Northern Ireland, because it was recognised that I'd worked in a community emerging from conflict, in a divided community. Do you see parallels here?
I do see parallels here, but frankly it's a lot more complicated here. There are at least 4 major groups here, and some would argue more. And we don't always, because I don't speak Dari and Pashto, the 2 most widespread languages here, I don't sometimes get the undercurrent of what's going on. But in a sense, there's no such thing as Afghanistan, or if you like, there's no such thing as the unity, and you can't help get the feeling that the whole Afghan mission is keeping a big lid on things, and that when it's taken off, Yugoslavia, for example, and Tito, that things might go horribly wrong. In a place like Northern Ireland, that small, and with your grouping so distinct, that's in a sense quite an easy thing to control. At most times you see it boil over now and again. If the same thing happens in Afghanistan, it'd be much, much harder to control.
It's very hard to imagine all these things. We're sitting here in this beautiful garden in a particularly nice Afghan restaurant, and yet all of these things are the case here in Afghanistan, and my memories from being here before is this sort of duality about life here.
One of the astonishing things about conflict zones, whether it's Northern Ireland or here, is just the sheer amount of normality that goes on day to day. People have an image from the outside, and they've had it with Belfast as well, that you're walking into a hail of bullets or a myriad of explosions. And we all know that that's not the case, that while appalling things do happen, the majority of people are still living relatively ordinary lives until it bursts into actual open warfare, as it has been in the past in Afghanistan. That's the way it will be. And I remember arriving in Belfast and having that image myself as an Englishman, and actually feeling some kind of, I don't know, almost childlike excitement about being in a city which I considered to be perhaps more of a war zone than it actually was, a slight thrill at living here and going out at night, you know, long before the ceasefires, and eventually just settling into a pattern of normal life where I'm just, you know, complaining that they've run out of stuff at M&S or whatever.
Mark, thank you very much. I think we'd better get the bill.
But while it's easy for us Westerners to settle the bill, Afghanistan is still one of the poorest countries in the world. Around 1/3 of the population is unemployed, and 1/3 lives below the poverty line. But here in Kabul, an affluent middle class has developed, thanks to the high salaries paid by government and the many aid agencies operating in the capital. If you can pay, you can shop at smart new malls, marry at enormous flashy wedding halls, and send your children, boys and girls, to one of the private universities. So has the last 10 years of international effort been worth it?
Driving through the streets of Kabul, and I'm delighted to see just how few women wearing burqas there are when you look out at the mass of humanity. And in their place, what seems to be dozens of groups of young schoolgirls wearing their black uniforms with white headscarves, carrying satchels to and from school, chattering away.
Today I'm running a seminar with women writers here in Kabul. These young women are amazing, full of ideas and energy.
I am Gula Froz, 21 years old, living in Kabul, studying at one of the private universities and working with one of the international NGOs. Some of the people think that terrorism is one of the major problems in Afghanistan. I think corruption is the major problem in Afghanistan. Like working with one of the international NGOs, I see it, I experience it every single day, that how difficult it is to work with the government.
But she is positive about the future.
According to my perspective, I think we are changing in a positive way, and people are more motivated to get education, and people are more motivated to have their jobs when working instead of just cultivating some drugs on their lands. People are more interested in having small businesses, and there are more women interested in small and medium-sized businesses, which helps them quite a lot, and they can support their family, and they are a big motivation for all other women in Afghanistan.
In terms of the local journalists that you work with, do you have women amongst them, or are they all men?
No, we have women as well. Yes, there are more men, but we have women as well, and even just having women journalists in our place is unusual, and they are able to perform the job in every way just as much as their male colleagues, and where we have some tension sometimes is if we have a guest coming in, and Afghan society, as you know, is very traditional and patriarchal. They're perfectly happy with the fact that a woman has interviewed them.
The whole world is now looking to the future of Afghanistan, and among those advising governments on how to deal with what's ahead is an academic from Queen's University.
Hello, I'm Michael Semple, a visiting professor at the Institute for Study of Conflict Transformation and Social Justice at Queen's University Belfast. I've worked in and on Afghanistan and Pakistan since the 1980s. The democratic experiment in Afghanistan was supposed to be about introducing the rule of law, introducing accountable government, and nobody should get the idea that this was somehow, just a Western import. This is something which had a great deal of resonance in Afghanistan, and that many Afghans saw was the way to escape from the conflict which had riven the country in the decades before the intervention. So if we look at what's been achieved since 2001, I think we can say there has been some progress towards democracy, but overall it's not yet robust, and I feel that we've delivered shoddy goods. I mean, this is a process which continues and which will last longer than the presence of Western troops, and which in a very important way should be quite familiar to people in Northern Ireland. Because for me it really parallels the way in which the setting up of robust institutions in Northern Ireland was an essential part of the process of escaping from a long conflict.
Do you think that the international community has learnt something over the involvement with Afghanistan about post-colonialism?
I think that the lessons of Afghanistan will be learnt a few years down the road. Partly when we know a bit more about how Afghanistan has turned out post-intervention. Partly when the people have to take the lessons on board, have got sort of less of a stake in it. So far, I think that most international players have had their hubris trimmed, that nobody's going to rush into a major intervention in a difficult country, assuming that a combination of force and money will be able to solve everything, because they've seen that it patently didn't work in Afghanistan.
So, do the people from Northern Ireland who I've talked to feel they have a stake in the future of Afghanistan?
If I reflect on 2006 when I first went to 2011 when I left the country, did I see a fundamental change in the way that country was, the security and the people? The answer has got to be yes. Is it the change that we wanted? It's certainly not the whole way, and I think come transition it'll still be a difficult place to be, but I think we've made an incredible difference, and it has cost lives, and it's cost lives of friends, and it's cost lives of colleagues, and I don't say this lightly, that them losing their lives was worth it, but they didn't give their lives in vain. They created something, and it's a sustainable and a better country now for having been there.
Were the Afghan people better for us being there? Where I was working? Absolutely. Of course they were. I was happy with what I'd done in my army career. I was happy with the job we'd done in Afghan. I was proud of the job we'd done. We'd done a great job for the people.
Living with his injuries has changed Colum's life forever.
I'm not Superman anymore, and that's took a while to just accept that. I used to carry myself a certain way, and I can't really do that anymore. So. No, my physicality was a massive part of my life, and I was taken out of my prime quite young, and that is maybe a difficult process. I need to get back out into society and do something worth note. I've got a little boy. I don't want him to look at me and go, well, yeah, okay, Dad, you lost your legs in Afghan, but what else did you do? So my fear is being that old bloke in a bar with an alcohol dependency, with a beard, talking about him getting blew up in Afghan 30 years ago and he hasn't moved on, So that's a very real fear, and that fear will make me do something productive and inspire and be inspired and keep living, keep pushing forward.
I wish I would have been able to interact with, more women out there and kind of feel like I helped in some way. And when I talked to family and friends, they said, oh, you did help, but I'm not so sure if I did or not. I know that I did my job, which was, I suppose, all that I could do, but I'm not really sure if I had a positive impact on the country or not. Do I regret going to Afghanistan? No. Do I regret what's happened in Afghanistan? Yeah, I do. I think, there's a lot of things that have happened in the country that the West needs to step up to the mark and help them with.
So what next for Afghanistan?
I wish I could be really hopeful about it, but having lived there and seen the level of poverty and corruption that there is, it's endemic right through every level of society. I would be concerned that folk that have been recruited into the security forces, into the police and the army, they're paid such a pittance for very, very dangerous work, and if they have opportunities, if someone is going to pay them a little bit more and they're going to be able to provide for their family, they'll surrender their posts. And I think we find that hard to understand.
I think we live in an island that has two tribes, and we struggle with those two tribes. It's much more complex there. There's 5, 6 main tribes and then lots of other smaller ones. And they have the same difficulties as we have in building trust with each other and living at peace with each other. So I'm not optimistic in the short term. I think that folk in the West don't understand that people in a country like Afghanistan would prefer strong leadership to fair leadership. And they often see democracies in the West as weak because of the way we elect our politicians. It limits their power. So there is within a lot of Afghans a desire for a strong government, and that from the outside might look like a dictator, but for them they actually prefer that.
I think that there will be a major bloodletting, and there really will. But I think that Afghanistan is likely to fracture in two.
This trip has gone so quickly, but Afghanistan is facing a long road ahead. So maybe the final word should go to an Afghan. So I asked Jamil whether he thinks the West has helped his country.
I have an optimistic view when I think about Afghanistan, because we have a elected democratic government, we have civil society organizations, we have the parliament, the constitution, and we enjoy international support. So Afghanistan is going towards the right path, and there are a lot of opportunities coming to Afghanistan. But it all depends to international support, regional cooperation, but most importantly, commitment of Afghans